Hey, hello, this is Editing Josh. As I was editing this episode, it became clear that if you didn't have the foundational knowledge on Iran and some of the players involved in the cyber operations, this episode might be a little difficult to follow. I would suggest listening to the Crash Course Iran episode first, if you haven't already, or you could just do it afterwards. It's longer, and I get it, it's a bit of a commitment. But I just wanted to add that this episode makes a lot more sense if you have that knowledge too. Anyway, on to the show. Welcome to the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Depp. In March 2025, 116 Iranian ghost ships, these are oil tankers dodging U.S. sanctions, smugglers of sorts, they all suddenly go dark. No GPS, no voice over IP, crews adrift in the Straits of Hormuz. A hacktivist group emerges. DOOKHTEGAN claims the kill shot with a supply chain attack via Favan's VSAT infrastructure. These are old school tactics, DD commands erasing partitions on hard drives. But was this actually hacktivism? Or was it a proxy group from afar? A nation state masquerading? Was Iran getting a taste of their own medicine, their own tactics used against them? Proxies for plausible deniability. In this episode, I discuss hacktivism, DOOKHTEGAN, and their attacks. Then I wrap it up with some thoughts on how hacktivism groups and state-backed groups can often overlap. The meta appeal of utilizing this tactic. And I'll sprinkle in some other examples and some motives and a little bit of good old speculation. We're definitely playing that conspiracy time song in this episode. But first, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
DOOKHTEGAN, translated as Sewn Lips from Farsi, is an Iranian hacktivist group that some claim emerged around late 2017, but wasn't really active until 2019. They are part of a wave of anti-government cyber collectives targeting the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, the group positions itself as dissident actors, focusing on exposing and disrupting the Iranian government. These are like the military and intelligence operations specifically. Now, throughout their campaigns, they've conducted hack and leak operations, intrusions into state-linked infrastructure, and destructive cyber attacks, while accusing Tehran of economic sanctions evasion, arms smuggling, and human rights abuses, which, to their point, are probably valid. Now, specifically, DOOKHTEGAN's activities are characterized by a mix of espionage, data leaks, and sabotage, with a recent emphasis on maritime and transport sectors. While their claimed attacks are extensive, some cybersecurity analysts suggest potential disinformation elements or ties to internal rivalries. For example, a rivalry between the MOIS, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. In other words, the MIS has taken shots at the IRGC, or vice versa, which to the untrained or uninitiated sounds dumb. Why are two groups from the same government on the same target getting in each other's way? But we are the initiated, aren't we, listeners? I watched The Dark Knight Rises on an airplane the other day, so I guess that's seeping through. Now, to my point, this is more common than it probably should be. There's allegations of Russian groups hitting the same target at the same time, and even Chinese groups stomping on each other's ops. Now, obviously, it's not the same thing, apples to apples. But when you're running IR, it's not uncommon to see multiple actors in the same pwned network as well, especially if the way they got in was like unpatched Exchange or like hard-coded Cisco creds that got leaked on the internet. Now, something on the edge of the network with a publicly available exploit is juicy to like anyone with a Shodan or a census account. Others believe that DOOKHTEGAN is a front group for other nations' state-backed units, particularly those from the United States or Israel. Think like the NSA, CIA, Mossad, or I guess like even 8200 could get lumped in there. There's some overlap in stated goals and things that make you say, maybe. Now, I'm going to explore those data points a little later on in the episode. My goal here is to outline the data points, explain some of the mental models that we can use to reason to each of these outcomes, and ultimately let you kind of come to your own conclusion. I don't have skin in the game or strong opinion either way. Now, pivoting to these attacks, DOOKHTEGAN first gained prominence for leaking tools and docs from the Iranian state-sponsored group APT-34, also known as Oil Rig. Let's discuss that now. This DOOKHTEGAN story begins in 2019, nearly 3 years after the Shadow Brokers, another hacktivist group, air quotes around hacktivist group in that one, dumped alleged NSA tools on the internet after failing to secure a ransom from the US government. I guess you could say DOOKHTEGAN was giving Iranian hackers a taste of that experience. Now, specifically, this group known as Oil Rig, or APT-34, I discussed them a little bit more in depth in my previous episode, Crash Course Iran, but the TLDR on them is that they're suspected to be part of the Iranian Ministry of Information and Security, the MOIS, which is the civilian side of the Iranian intelligence apparatus. They report to the president of Iran, as opposed to like the IRGC. Now, starting in March of 2019, on a Telegram channel, the group, persona, entity, dubbed DOOKHTEGAN, started dumping APT-34's secret data. I'm talking about their tools, how they're used, IP addresses of all the Iranian intelligence collection teams. Now, this is the infrastructure they use to conduct their operations. Evidence of their attacks, or at least 66 victims of their attacks. And the cherry on top, the identity, along with photographs of some of the officials and the keyboard commanders. Oof. But obviously, this level of detail on an adversary is something cyber threat intelligence teams yearn for. And releasing this information in the public obviously sets back their operations for a bit. They need to retool, they need to re-equip, and as every security company, vendor, and team worth their salt now has signatures, behaviors, and IOCs for how this group operates. Also, governments around the world now have strong dossiers on individuals of interest, unless this was one of those dossiers being leaked by a government, like it was information they already had. And, well, that's a hint for conspiracy time later. I haven't played the song yet. Now, on the group's Telegram channel, they highlighted the following, quote, "We are exposing here the cyber tools, APT-34/Oil Rig, that the ruthless Iranian Ministry of Intelligence has been using against Iran's neighboring countries, including names of the cruel managers and information about the activities and the goals of these cyber attacks." End quote. And then they further went on to say, quote, "We hope that the other Iranian citizens will act for exposing this regime's real ugly face." End quote. Now, calling for the citizens of Iran to rise up against the regime is a common trend you'll observe. I discussed this in a little bit more during the Said Unsaid conspiracy time. I'm really building that up. Now, going back to this attack, in addition to dumping all the information on victims and infrastructure, as well as tools on the internet, the naming and shaming of public people with their information out there could put them in a little bit of danger. Now, this is kind of a big step. It's a big escalation. It's not novel, as the United States has named and issued warrants for people part of cyber operations against the United States. And even Australia has as well for individuals that hacked and released medical information online in exchange for ransoms. Now, the Chinese would probably love to do this to the Western keyboard commandos, but I don't think they have all that information, besides the bulk data that they stole from OPM or something. And at this point, that data is probably so stale. And if they did use it, well, that would kind of admit guilt. Or if they push the wrong person and it can be publicly disproven, well, the Chinese don't really like to be publicly embarrassed. Now, DOOKHTEGAN's release of this information helps other governments put these individuals on lists to monitor for visas and potentially gives internal Mossad spies or international jump out boys a reason to kidnap or assassinate that person. And I guess if you're one of those people, that could probably be a big issue in you getting to sleep at night or rethinking that family vacation. Now, at the conclusion of this campaign, the Sewed Lips group, DOOKHTEGAN, promised that they were just getting started and encouraged everyone to share their work and follow along. And I'm going to do the same. So please share this podcast and follow it as well. And with that, let's pivot into the hack and leak years for DOOKHTEGAN, roughly 2020 through 2024. From 2020 to 2024, there were roughly 20 to 25 public doxings per their X Telegram channel. I don't read Farsi, and I fear that some of the names were just misspelled differently when I compared their X or Twitter to the Telegram channel. I asked some of the LLMs to come up with a total based on my collected messages, and well, that's how I settled on 20 to 25. So, needless to say, there's a lot of public doxing going on, and that number is a little squishy. But this isn't a legal brief or scholarly work, so let's just roll with it. The TLDR is that there were public doxings. That's what I'm trying to establish. Now, if someone wants to sue me for slander, let me know and I'll issue the correction, I guess. Now, as with most doxing campaigns, the effects were mostly reputational and economic. I guess you could say there's some security concerns sprinkled in, but I didn't find anything indicating that these people's well-being were being jeopardized. There were some sweet sanctions put on some of the exposed figures, though. There were also bounties of up to $10,000 US driving insider tips. DOOKHTEGAN has got some deep pockets, it seems. Now, in March and April of 2021, documents emerged highlighting an operation called Project Signal. Now, these leaked internal documents discuss tools, flowcharts for tools or malware operations, and planning of various campaigns. Now, all the signals point to this being a state-sponsored ransomware campaign, revealing the IRGC's use of contractors for global extortion. It's not a super common trend among these groups, but it happens from time to time. As a general rule, follow the money is a good model to think about any group or part of your analysis. For example, in Western nations, these state-sponsored ransomware attacks aren't as prominent. Now, I'm sure there's some CIA or other IC community op that has been utilized. But for the most part, Western keyboard commandos, they aren't moonlighting as ransomware operators. The potential targets are most likely broke or sanctioned, or they're not going to pay a ransom. The West will likely prosecute you if that is found. And just because of the nature of politics and the state of leaks and anonymous sources and how leaky the US government is, someone with sympathy to Iran, China, Russia, they could very well leak this to a reporter that has the same sympathies, or do this via like an anonymous source, and it's going to be on everyone's front page for newspapers or CNN, YouTube, X, and probably a number of Substacks and other stuff that I'm missing. Probably a bunch of TikToks. And kind of going along with my first point here is that there's really too much to lose for Western folks to do this. Clearances, they probably have families and stuff like that. It's not worth it to ransomware people and know that there's a good chance that you'll go to jail. But back to the campaign itself, tracked as Project Signal, it started between late July 2020 and early September 2020. Now, the project began with the EMETNet Passcard, or ENP. And I know I'm probably butchering that. I've only read it, but we're going to roll with it. Now, this organization is tasked with carrying out the operations, specifically their research organization, or the quote-unquote study centers. Now, they were putting together a list of around 25 targets and their websites to go after. The next effect of this hack and leak operation was that it exposed tactics, which in turn aided in attribution and defenses. Now, this contributed to a broader awareness of Iranian cybercrime funding proxies. Now, I'm going to highlight a few of these 2022 attacks. On September 28, 2022, DOOKHTEGAN publicized details of 2021 cyber attacks carried out by IRGC contractors on U.S. hospitals. The biggest name of this attack was Boston's Children's Hospital, framing them as part of a broader regime terrorism. Now, this exposure contributed to U.S. indictments and heightened scrutiny on Iranian cyber threats. And obviously, targeting a hospital, let alone a children's hospital, is something that warrants that, in my opinion. Now, later on October 30th, 2025, the doxing of Mustafa Samardi occurred. Now, the group leaked personal and professional details of Samardi, the administrative financial deputy of the IRGC front company, ENP, and they labeled him as a quote-unquote cyber terrorist. This was part of ongoing efforts to target IRGC cyber enablers. Now, keeping up with that, on November 21st, 2022, DOOKHTEGAN revealed that Akcar Systems, this is an IRGC link company, hacked an allied country system for extortion. They also leaked internal misconduct including alcohol use and illicit relations among employees. Now, the goal here is to sow distrust within regime circles and create some internal chaos. Now, on December 9th, 2022, the group exposed secret cyber attacks by the IRGC company Ilent Ghostar against international media, Voice of America, and BBC Persia, as well as Bahrain's election process, aiming to undermine the regime's propaganda and foreign relations. Now, fast forward to November 2023, and the personal attacks continued. DOOKHTEGAN took aim at the Shahid Hamet group. Now, this is an IRGC group or subunit. Specifically, they fall under the Islamic Republic Guard Corps Cyber Electronic Command, or more publicly known or commonly known as the IRGC CEC. Now, publicly, the IRGC CEC is a group also tracked as Tortoiseshell, and there's some overlap with Crimson Sandstorm, association. Our first victim from this group was Mohammed Reza Rahavidin. It named him as a cyber operative in the group and accused him of targeting U.S. critical infrastructure like water systems and the defense industry. There was an attached collage featuring Rahavidin's photos across ages, including prison mugshots, along with images of his wife and young kids. All of this was aiming to publicly shame regime supporters and put a face to their operations. And, it sounds like Iran has made great leaps in prison reform, though. Felons getting tech jobs, that doesn't happen here in the United States. And not often. I know some keyboard justice warrior is probably firing up their email client to point out some 4 examples where I was wrong as we speak. Just clear jet here. I'm speaking in a generalized fashion. And I'm probably not going to read your email anyway. Now, more broadly, though, it can't be directly tied to this, but Shahid Hamet's activities, the IRGC subunit, prompted a U.S. $10 million bounty in October 2024 for its leaders, highlighting the escalation in Iran-U.S. cyber tensions. Now, DOOKHTEGAN's post also solicits more info and intel to aid in opposition analysis. And that's how it ended. Once again, these are calls for uprising and to leak information. But then 1 month later, DOOKHTEGAN was at it again. This time, they were taking aim at Muhammad Kunzani. His photos were blasted all over the internet as well, and he was purportedly an operative in the Shahid Hamet Industrial Group, the SHIG. Now, this is a IRGC entity sanctioned by the U.S. for advancing Iran's liquid fuel ballistic missile capabilities, like those used in the Shahid 3. Now, that may sound familiar as it was talked about quite a bit like a decade or so ago. Now, the Shahid 3 translates to the shooting star in Farsi or Persian. Now, it's a medium-range ballistic missile, or MRBM, and it was developed by Iran. Now, it was Iran's first domestically produced missile capable of reaching targets beyond its borders, such as Israel or parts of the Middle East, all within a range of approximately 1,300 kilometers. Now, this missile is liquid fuel, it's road mobile, and can also be silo-based, making it difficult to detect and target. However, since it is liquid fuel, it does take a little bit of time to make it operational, unlike solid fuel rockets. Now, fun fact, the Shahab 3 is based on North Korean's Nodong-1 technology, though Iran claims it was a native design. Now, this is kind of important looking back because the Iranian weapon industry has gotten significantly larger. A lot of their drones, specifically like the Shahid drones, are used in the Russia-Ukraine conflict now and by various proxies like the Houthis. Now, the Shahid in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the rebranded white box version of it called the Garan 2 of loitering drones. Now, anyway, this doxing of this individual had little observable impact to the Western world. Now, in Iran, maybe that's a different story, or maybe they made him a target for Operation Rising Lion, but none of that is reported and freely posted on the internet, so it's hard to know. Now, DOOKHTEGAN kept on the doxing campaign through 2024, and in January, they targeted Department 4000 of the IRGC-IO. Now, specifically, these are people that are coordinating special operations, which include hacking, surveillance, and logistics for the proxy militias. Think the Houthis or Hezbollah. I don't know why this is considered special, but that's what the post says in the article, so that's what I'm going with it. Now, in this post specifically, it was related to Hezbollah. Now, I'm going to circle back to this in a second. But the first individual targeted here was Azim Kadami, a deputy in Division 4000 or Department 4000. He was involved in the coordination or the logistics of this. Now, LabDOOKHTEGAN obtained and published his profile in December of 2023, with follow-up references in January of 2024, describing him as a key operative in the terrorist intelligence efforts. Now, the second individual was Hamad Zulfi Gul, a commander in the IRGC's secretive Shahab al-Zama battalion, a special forces unit linked to the IRGC IO ops. Now, on January 26, 2024, his birthday, LabDOOKHTEGAN gave him a birthday wish, air quotes. They doxed his entire background, that he was born in Tehran, to parents Ahmed and Zaib. His phone number was censored. I don't know if YouTube would give me a strike for publishing personal information, and I don't really want to find out, along with his battalion role. Now, this post aimed to humanize and shame him while exposing the battalion's terror logistics, arms smuggling, and proxy support. Now, back to the Hezbollah connection, or Hezbollah. This is where things got interesting and where it appears the group LabDOOKHTEGAN is more sophisticated than normal hacktivists. These January leaks detailed IRGC IO supply chains for terrorist groups, including procurement networks and funding flows. The core revelation here was the use of Bitcoin wallets to launder and transfer funds for their operations. Now, obviously, this is an attempt to bypass traditional sanctions. Specific wallet addresses were published, linking them to the IRGC IO commanders and front companies like ENP, the cyber firm tied to the ransomware attacks I discussed a little earlier with Project Signal. Now, this built on earlier 2022 and 2023 exposures of the IRGC cyber personas using cryptocurrencies for election interference and ransomware proceeds. The group incentivized further leaks by offering Bitcoin payments for tips, emphasizing confidentiality. However, shortly after, on February 2nd, 2024, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, under Executive Order 13224, announced sanctions on individuals with ties to the subunit and the proxy front company. These targeted 6 IRGC CEC officials overlapping with the IRGC IO, Ops for Malicious Cyber Activities. Now, this included attacks on the U.S. water system and the Boston Children's Hospital that I talked about earlier. 2 years after LabDOOKHTEGAN released evidence of those attacks as well. Now, putting my cards on the table, I don't believe sanctions really work in the modern world. Now, this could be an entire episode, so I'm going to try and keep it brief. But economic sanctions are a tool for modern foreign policy, designed as a middle ground between diplomacy and military force. The core theory is that by withdrawing customary trade, financial, or other relations, sanctions create economic pressure on a target government or entities, compelling it to change behavior that it violates, such as international norms, or the use of aggression, or terrorism support, nuclear proliferation, or human rights abuses. There's a lot of reasons people get sanctioned. Now, the big players sanctioned, at least here in the United States, are Russia, Iran, Cuba, and North Korea. And to my point, in that they don't work, these countries have all been sanctioned in some form or another since you and I were born. And obviously, there's no tension with any of them now as we wrap up the year 2025. And they're all outstanding citizens on the world stage. They're literally doing nothing that here in the West we don't want them to do. I mean, I guess more recently you could throw Venezuela in that group of great actors as well. Obviously, that's a joke. Now, speaking more modern, tariffs could possibly be seen as a form of sanctions as well, at least in the way that they're being used. I think this is really stupid from the Trump administration, since this is a good way to get those overturned, but I'm just a podcaster that makes up stuff in a makeshift sound studio talking on the internet. So I guess it doesn't really matter. Now, this all works on the dated idea that American interests are the only interests in the world, which was certainly true after post-World War II. But in today's multipolar world, other nations have kind of caught up, which, in my opinion, is probably a good thing, especially as soon as politicians come on board and realize that empire maintenance is expensive and presents a cost to the domestic populace, but also means it's difficult to bully other nations that have their own interests, goals, and culture. Also, those lobbyists are just going to have to lobby for something else now. But without going super deep, sanctions are pretty cheap for politicians to enact to seem like they're being tough on quote unquote the problem. But like most things in life, the execution is horrible. Globalization and technology make circumventing them pretty easy. Not all allies of the United States honor the sanctions, and then that puts you in like a weird foreign policy loop. Now, the EU has loopholes to buy Russian oil, but at an extreme markup because it has to be transferred to different flagged vessels and stuff. India gets tariffs on them for buying said sanctioned oil. It's all really just a mess. And then lastly, it's always the civilians that feel the pain. Now, contrary to popular belief, they don't start resenting their leaders either, at least not publicly. That's how you and your family tree gets mowed down by anti-aircraft guns. Instead, you have hungry, highly propagandized individuals circling the flag and supporting these regimes more and more. The same regimes that are drinking sanctioned cognac while the populace doesn't have power or they're dying because they can't get aircraft parts for their aging airliners or they can't find food. And like I said, I could go on. But ultimately, sanctioning these individuals only highlight who they are and make it harder for them to vacation abroad. And in theory, I guess, to visit the United States. All right, let's get off this side quest and back to the main purpose here. In February and March of 2024, Lab2Tagan continued the doxing campaign of Azim Kadami. This is the head of the logistics for the Department 4000. This time, it was his photo. They claimed he was responsible for ammunition transfers and supporting proxy conflicts in the region under Commander Javad Jafari. Commander Jafari is a U.S.-sanctioned IRGC figure known for roles in Syria's siege of Aleppo, and he oversees these activities that support the Iranian militias, or they're like terror proxies. These leaks also revealed the Kashan base, or the Kashan Air Base as it's often referred to, and Hezbollah training grounds for operations involving drones. Now, Kashan served as a key hub for the Iranian drone or UAV program, focusing on the production, testing, and export of these unmanned aerial vehicles to support regional proxy operations. The regional proxy here being Hezbollah. So, in addition to supplying them with drones, they trained them on how to use them. I'm sure other groups like the Houthis have been given similar training, maybe even the Russians. Now, the last doxing in this multi-year campaign that I'm going to talk about was dispersed through July 2024 to September 2024. The target here was Gohada Fatim, as aliased by Goharat Kolam. And I'm butchering that, but I'm trying my best here. Now, he was identified as the commander of the IRGC Unit 8040. Now, this information included his birthday, which was September 1st, 1966, his national ID, which I'm going to redact, and his father's name. It was also accompanied by numerous photos. Now, the second target was Sahid Ahmed Husani, a member of the IRGC Group 8040, and this was the Cyber Air Defense Training Unit, and it's involved in electronic warfare and proxy support, like those providing support to Hezbollah in this case. The information provided included his national ID and information about his prior role in Unit 8000, and there were also posts about possible election interference. Now, this was late 2024, leading up to the election in November, an election in which Donald Trump would win. Spoiler alert, I guess. Now, we're going to talk more about other election interference campaigns in a moment. And Microsoft also posted a report and a blog highlighting election interference from this group or someone adjacent to this group. I'll link through to it if you want to read it. Essentially, it's standing up fake websites and sock puppet accounts to appeal to certain voter bases. And I'm going to lay my cards on the table here. I want to discuss these campaigns, but also expose my bias to you from the beginning. To be honest, I don't understand this campaign or campaigns like this. The course of action on these attacks. People are so siloed and so split due to things like domestic media that only extreme left-wing people will read extreme left-wing media, and only the same can be said on the right. No person wearing a MAGA hat, or a Make America Great Again hat, is watching Rachel Maddow and saying, you know what, she has a point. And there's no person rioting in front of an ICE compound listening to Tucker Carlson on their way home. The piece earlier also highlighted that there was PSYOP campaigns talking about how President Trump was impulsive and, well, just a really, really bad person. Now, Gemini or ChatGPT probably could have wrote better propaganda. I think the goal here is more or less to be a troll and cause social unrest within the country. I mean, face it, people know by now who Trump is. You've already had him for 4 years as a president, and he's been a public figure for like ever. Stupid posts on the internet are not going to sway people one way or the other. They've already made up their opinions about the guy. Maybe I'm being too harsh, but I think we put a lot more value in these election interference campaigns than there actually are. Karen from the suburbs posts something stupid on Facebook and you call her an idiot or whatever. Some college student posts a message on TikTok completely devoid of history and basic facts. What are they? They're naive. They're clueless. Insert whatever adjective you want. Now, Sergey in Moscow posts the same thing and it's election interference. But this time he did it with a Gen AI picture of a pretty woman, screen named Jessica. What do you think people are going to think with this? They think Jessica is an idiot and they keep doom scrolling on to the next idiot or guru on the internet. There's also the fact that I could be biased too because of who wrote this article. The author of the paper is Clint Watts, the general manager for Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. Now, nothing against the person. I'm not a fan of his work or his book, Messing with the Enemy. Now, I'm going off on a tangent here, but that really doesn't apply to this episode, so I'll leave it here. I just want to be upfront and honest in my analysis. And as always, things can change, people can change. But the point is that I have a hard time believing these election interference campaigns are as effective as they're positioned to be. There's probably numerous other places to look for election interference first. And most of this congressional testimony around it post-2016 confirmed really two things. First, our elected leaders have no clue how the internet actually works. And they want to control the content allowed on social media. Both sides. This isn't like a right or left thing. Democrat or Republican or whatever. And now with saying that, I really hope that my cloud-only login Windows 11 laptop lets me connect after this episode airs. I'm just kidding. I don't have that kind of reach. Time to shill. This podcast's growth has been organically driven from sparse marketing posts that I sometimes remember to do and from listeners like you. I don't post often as it takes time to produce these episodes, and that's what I'd like to focus on. So if you enjoy these episodes and you want to help me promote the show, please like, subscribe, leave reviews, and share with your network. It really helps the algorithms and the discoverability of the show. Now, if you want to be more involved with the community and get access to the Ask Me Anything forums, please go over to IntrusionsInDepth.com and sign up there. You'll get notified when a new episode drops and whenever subscriber-only opportunities arise, like calls for AMA questions or calls for guests. Now, back to the show. Now, periodically, there would be more doxing of key personnel within Iran. I could continue to highlight more and more of these people, but the reality is that it's a bunch of people with names that are hard for me to pronounce and that you've never heard of. And I'm concerned I'm already brushing up against YouTube's content moderation policies on topics that are close to like the doxing rules. So let's revisit the election interference campaigns. The first doxing hack and leak operation that took place was in mid to late 2024, where the group exposed documents, emails, and personal details related to the Iranian state-sponsored efforts to meddle in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Now, these leaks primarily targeted the IRGC cyber operations focused on the Shahed Shostari cyber unit. Now, this is another internal code for the front company, ENP. They're also tracked as Cotton Sandstorm by Microsoft, and associated structures within the IRGC kind of falls under there, like Unit 8040. Now, this is the IRGC Cyber Electronics Command, the subunit that's involved in like offensive cyber activities. I don't know how I would feel if I was considered an offensive operator and my main job was making memes. I mean, it sounds fun for a week or so, but then it would probably get old pretty fast. Now, the overarching goal of the dumps aimed to reveal Iran's attempts to influence U.S. elections through disinformation, infrastructure targeting, and intelligence gathering. Also worth mentioning that it aligns with the broader geopolitical tensions and U.S. warnings about foreign interference. As a note of personal injection, I'm a little surprised the story wasn't picked up more from American media. One of my frustrations, I guess, is there's a lot of TLP, trust me, bro, and hand waving from organizations. Even the old, I've got top secret briefings that I can't share, but trust me, I'm telling the truth, is a little suspect in my book. Just because someone slapped a banner marker on something they made up or ChatGPT made up doesn't make it more reliable. This has always kind of been an issue with cyber threat intelligence. Now, I'm not going to go too deep here, but sometimes the paid services or even public reporting from organizations is better than top secret intel as far as being accurate. But because you have to be special or read in on top secret information, I guess it has more value, at least to people's heads. Now, sometimes I think people exploit that to make opinions sound more like facts. Whatever, that's a bit of a tangent as well. But when I was researching this episode, it just seemed odd that this wasn't out here more. Now, considering in the past, election interference was all the rage, maybe they A/B tested this in like focus groups and found that people really don't care. Now, the timeline of this operation spanned July to September 2024, and it overlapped with the heightened U.S. intelligence alerts from Microsoft in August that I just spoke about. Now, all of this was in the run-up to the November election, and there was no major destructive elements like wipers or something involved. It was mostly just disinformation and trying to cause kind of chaos and doubt amongst people. Now, let's discuss this a little bit further in depth, though. I mean, this is kind of the niche of the podcast after all. Now, the dumps included internal IRGC documents, email addresses used for phishing and disinformation, organizational structures, and personal identifiers of key personnel. Now, some of the specific examples were email addresses tied to EMP operations, those being Eugene Swargis at Outlook.com and Michael Singh at Yahoo.com, were used for social engineering and targeting of U.S. entities. There were also documents detailing election meddling plans, such as targeting swing states, disrupting voter registration, and spreading rumors via fabricated media. In addition to that, there was broader intel on IRGC cyber hierarchies, including links between EMP and Unit 8040, and this revealed their roles in past elections, like those in 2020. Now let's look at some of the tactics involved here. Now, the leaks revealed that Iranian tactics mirrored those reported in U.S. intelligence reports, and like those from Microsoft or the DOJ. But these are specifically attributed to EMP, or Unit 8040. The official reports didn't go that deep into the attribution. See previous rant. There was intelligence gathering on swing states, Senate candidates, and unstable regions. Additionally, there was evidence of direct messaging to politicians and social engineering via spoofed emails. Then there was the usual disruption and influence portion, polluting voting systems, although it's not apparent how successful this was, and disrupting registrations. Once again, not clear on how effective that was either. I couldn't find reporting that tied these two things together or reports that said wide-scale voter disenfranchisement occurred. I suspect with early voting and mail-in voting, they would have to keep this operation going for a while. Plus, U.S. voting rules and hygiene really isn't top of mind for most states. Lastly, there was the rumors and chaos that always kind of comes with allegations of election meddling, and this was present in this document as well. At the end of all this, Lab.2Tagan used the dumps to solicit more tips, positioning themselves as whistleblowers against the regime and quote-unquote against cyber terrorism. As with most of their calls to action, it was to provoke a sort of grassroots uprising to the Iranian people against the mullahs, the government. Now, obviously, as of October of 2025, that hasn't worked. In March of this year, though, Lab.2Tagan woke up and they chose violence. Well, to be fair, they probably coordinated this for a while, so they had to have been waking up and going to bed choosing violence for a while. In March of 2025, Lab.2Tagan attacked 116 oil tankers and cargo ships from the NITC and the IRISL, as well as the communications company Favana Group. Now, to break down these acronyms, the NITC stands for the National Iranian Tanker Company. This is Iran's state-sponsored oil tanker operator. They're responsible for transporting Iranian crude oil, their exports, and carrying out the maritime activities that goes along with that. It's one of the largest tanker fleets in the Middle East. with vessels often involved in evading international sanctions through tactics like going dark, which is code for disabling the AIS tracking. Now, AIS in this context means automatic identification system. It's a system used to avoid collisions at sea. Now, if you know anything about boats and how water works, you can probably understand why they would like to know where everyone's at and hope you have that system on. NITC is a subsidiary of the National Iranian Oil Company, and they've been designated by the U.S. Treasury as providing support to Iran's government and military entities, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which I don't think is a shocker to anyone, but that explains why they've been sanctioned. IRISL stands for the Islamic Republic of Iran's Shipping Lines. Now, this is Iran's state-owned shipping company that operates a fleet of cargo vessels, including container ships and bulk carriers. IRISL handles international shipping that pretty much isn't oil. For Iran, this has been heavily sanctioned as well, especially by countries like the United States. And other countries, though, too, and proliferating weapons, mostly to terror networks like Hamas and Hezbollah, and even other nation states that are hostile, like North Korea and Russia. The Favana Group is an Iranian information and communications technology holding company. Now, it was established in 2022 and provides services such as satellite communication, data centers, broadband internet, and IT infrastructure. Now, it operates as a private entity, but it serves major clients in Iran's public and private sectors, including maritime communications via VSAT. That's very small aperture terminal networks. Now, Favana holds various ICT license and is involved in Iran's telecommunications ecosystem. Now, this attack on the 116 vessels is pretty gnarly. Lab DOOKHTEGAN infiltrated the networks of Favana Group through a method that isn't really reported on, likely spear phishing or some bug in Exchange or another forward-facing application. I would imagine Iran's having trouble getting the newest software releases, as you'll quickly find out. Then, the attackers migrated to the Linux-based VSAT terminals. Now, using the super sophisticated command of DD, they proceeded to wipe storage partitions by overwriting them all with zeros. And that's what experts would call quite an escalation. Now, fun fact, DD doesn't actually stand for data destroyer, as that's what it's almost always used for, but instead it stands for data duplicator or disk dump, according to sources I found on the internet. Now, the attackers also disabled the iDirect Falcon processes, a software component for maintaining ship-to-shore connectivity. This severed satellite links, AIS, or Automatic Information System Tracking, and Voice over IP, or VoIP, communications. Effectively, these made these ships dead in the water, or at the very least, extremely difficult to navigate and operate without incident. Specifically speaking, this attack occurred on March 18, 2025, which is important to note that the United States was also doing something on March 18th in the region as well. In response to the Houthis' aggression on maritime travel, attacking by some estimates up to 190 ships in the matter of weeks, on March 15th to the 18th, the United States launched a fresh round of bombings on Yemen, targeting Houthis and Houthi strongholds. The stated goal was to degrade the capabilities of the terrorist group and to send a message for their maritime hostilities. Now, there's a bit to dissect here from all the information. First of which, getting actions on objectives, this time 116 shipping vessels, requires a level of coordination and automation that takes time and recon to execute against. They need to get a lay of the land. This would suggest that they were in the network for an extended period of time without detection, maybe weeks, months. Second, hitting maritime vessels is also tricky as you're relying on slow communication channels and spotty connections. Third, the timing of this raises some suspicion. It was the last day of a 3-day attack by the United States. So, option one is that they were sitting on this for a while, waiting for the perfect time to execute. Then they got a hold of the SecDef or SecWar signal chat, and they knew the operation was coming, so they went after it. I think it's SecWar, right? Department of War? Whatever. Option two is that they saw these attacks on the Houthis and figured that they could spin up a quick win and get Shodan out and start looking for targets to hit. Now, the Linux-based boxes aren't as complicated as I suspect, and they just kind of YOLO'd it and wiped out everything on the network, which ironically was just those two entities bypassing sanctions. Option three is that there's some coordination. I want to emphasize that I don't have any insider knowledge or know anything outside of what's being reported. Even on the group's X and Telegram posts, though, they hint at something with the phrase, quote, friends who are friends of our enemies. Now, is this the United States? Israel? Who knows? I'll tackle that in a bit. But it's hard to argue against both of these countries having the means, motive, and opportunity to do so. I mean, sure, we have seen other countries possess this capability or similar ones. Russia comes to mind. And I would imagine the Chinese, Europeans, the Australians, the Kiwis, New Zealand, they could probably do it all as well. But who would have the motivation? Well, that sort of narrows down that pool. Anyway, there's plenty of other speculation throughout this episode, but let's jump on to the next attack, the second wave of these maritime attacks. The second cyber attack, claimed by DOOKHTEGAN on August 22nd, 2025, targeted 64 vessels, 39 oil tankers, and 25 cargo ships. This operation built directly on the group's initial breach from March of 2025, exploiting what I would assume is near constant persistence across the Havana Group's infrastructure. Now, the attack focused on destructive sabotage rather than embarrassment or the quasi-espionage of leaking documents. There was some of that too, though. The reporting and the analysis of this is a little squishy, as the attacks are less than 90 days old at the time of this recording. But it appears during the March attack, they established some sort of persistence in the Havana networks, and then they came back in June or possibly even as early as May to start planning for this action. So if this is true, well, it indicates a level of sophistication to remain unnoticed for that long in a network. Or on the contrary, it indicates that Havana's networks aren't really highly defended or monitored, and they didn't learn anything from getting wrecked the first time. Now, the likely answer is that it's a mixture of both. Also sprinkled in there is the issue of sanctions, probably makes it hard to get updates on software and hardware. Or they may see no reason in updating the software as it, quote unquote, currently works. Now, the screenshots provided in the Telegram site paint the picture pretty well, and it gives us insights into how they prosecuted this attack. In the first set of screenshots, we see that they have root access on Linux terminals, and the software version for these systems is 2.6.35, which refers to the embedded Linux kernel here. Now, using high-tech tools on the computer, I was able to track down when that kernel was released, and it was October 1st, 2010. So that means they're running a 15-year-old kernel at this point. Now, I'm not a maritime expert by any means, but I have watched Pirates of the Caribbean recently, so I do know that the most up-to-date version of this software is iDirect Satellite software IDX 4.5, which it was released in April of this year, 2025. So the reality is that with this old software, there's a myriad of exploits probably available to gain access. Next, they answered how they mapped out the entire fleet. It turns out the database has entries for every modem, and they named all the modem devices with the name of the vessel. For example, the IRISL Daisy or the IRISL Arden. Once again, IRISL being the Islamic Republic of International Shipping Lanes. This is a sanctioned company. So that does make filtering a little easier. Now, the piece of the stack they specifically targeted was called Falcon, not to be confused with CrowdStrike's Falcon solution. Shutting down Falcon, though, made the terminals go dark, which does sound an awful lot like the Kraut censored. The evidence for their long-term persistence is in the series of screenshots where they do some testing. They would shut it down for a while and then monitor for email notifications for the node going down. This also indicates that the attackers had access to their emails as well. Then, in the last act of sabotage, they once again released the DD Kraken and overwritten the hard drives with zeros. This is the navigation logs, the message archives, system configurations, and even recovery partitions. The impact of all this, well, you are out at sea with no navigation, no tracking capabilities of other vessels, and no way to bring it back online. There's also some more interesting data in the screenshots released. There was a spreadsheet with all the voice over IP or VoIP network, which was mapped out, as well as the clear text passwords, which of course were industry standard of being long and complex with special characters. I'm kidding. It was just a username and the @ symbol with the vessel name for the password. Pretty baller. I don't think there's reporting on this, but with this, you could probably listen in and even impersonate people with the network access. Or you could just call them and just be annoying, maybe telling them to do some regime change so that this doesn't happen in the future. Just saying. We've seen that tactic before. At the very least, it makes things more chaotic by killing comms and making the stranded sailors feel more isolated. That's playing into the psychological aspect of this attack. Just like the first attack on these vessels, it overlaps temporally and thematically with U.S. activities targeting Iran. Now, I want to emphasize this. While no direct evidence confirms U.S. coordination or backing of this group as it maintains its independent dissident stance, the attack's timing and focus on sanctioned entities suggest opportunistic alignment with American efforts to pressure Iran's economy and their proxy networks. Now, once again, not being a maritime expert, but someone who has seen Battleship and other documentaries on boat stuff, it likely requires each of these stranded vessels to be towed back to port. The tugboat, tow truck vessel, likely needs to harden their systems, as I would imagine they're a prime target for further espionage and would quote unquote be a lawful target for lawyers in Washington that are actually approving the strikes, if Lab DOOKHTEGAN is actually American backed. Once they get back to port, though, the software needs to be reinstalled. Now, in a perfect world, this would be new software, not running on the end-of-life Linux kernel, but the reality is that Iran's economy isn't booming, and they can't just go out to companies and buy it. Plus, I don't even know if I would buy new software if I was the Iranians, to be honest. We've seen what new telecommunications equipment gets you. Explosives from Israeli front companies. So that means you got to take apart everything that kind of enters your borders and start looking for tool marks near screw holes and stuff. So in essence, this cripples the Ghost Fleet for weeks or months, thus strangles their economy and their ability to ship oil. Now, Lab DOOKHTEGAN explicitly stated that the motivation for the attack was sabotage against Iran's sanctions evading and proxy arming activities, once again positioning itself as a dissident activist. However, this overlap fuels speculation that the group serves as a proxy for U.S. or Israeli interests, providing plausible deniability in hybrid warfare. Now, it can be difficult to understand and attribute or prepare for hacktivist groups like those of Lab DOOKHTEGAN. I'm going to spend the next bit of time diving deeper into this, but the overarching idea is that anyone can claim to be a hacktivist or hide their true motives. It's very rare for someone to appear on Telegram or X or, Breach forums and be like, I'm Jim of the 300th Department of Cyber Warfare and the Quds Force or something like that. Well, and actually be truthful. And it's not as easy as playing Risk either. It was Colonel Mustard in the DC with the interpreter payload. It's a jumbled mess and it takes time to sort out. Tracking infrastructure, things like public SSH keys or port banners on open servers, sometimes taking a gander at open servers itself, then looking at post-exploitation TTPs, forensic artifacts, and finally the good old means, motive, and opportunity tests, the law and order analysis as I call it. Since 2015 and again in 2022 and 2023, there's been a slew of these groups that have emerged. Lab DOOKHTEGAN is probably the most well-known, but in the 2015 era as well, you could throw in Tapanagan and Arad Sec Team. I'm probably mispronouncing them. Well, I'm definitely mispronouncing them, but I've only read them. But as of recently, I think they're the mostly all defunct or they've went dormant now. Now, in 2022, there was a catalyst event for internal dissidents within Iran. There's probably numerous ones of those, but this one got out to the wider audience. In September 2022, a 22-year-old Iranian woman named Masa, or sometimes Gina as she's called, Amini, died in police custody in Tehran. She had been arrested by Iran's police for allegedly not wearing her hijab properly. Yes, in case you're wondering, that's a law in Iran. Now, many believed, like myself, that the police beat her, leading to her death. Now, this sparked huge anger across the Iranian people, and they took to the streets in what was known as the Woman, Life, and Freedom Uprising. Protests last months into 2022, with women and young people leading calls to end the strict Islamic Republic rules, especially those against women's rights. But like all authoritarian regimes, the government cracked down hard, killing hundreds and arresting thousands. Now, during these protests, new Iranian hacker groups popped up, hacktivists. It's likely that some of these are people living outside of Iran, but some of them could be people living on the inside too. Or it could be a foreign intelligence agency seeing an opportunity to inflict regime change. Now, their main tactic, attack and leak, breaking into government computers, stealing secret files, and releasing them online to embarrass officials, revealing abuses or disruption of operations. Pretty much what I've been talking about this entire episode. Now, this helps protesters by spreading the truth and sowing chaos and pressuring the government without physical risk. These groups say they're born from the people to support the uprising. I'll break down some of the more well-known groups right now. The first of which was Black Reward, which started right after Amini's death in late 2022. They hacked big targets like the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization and sent 5 million text messages to Iranians urging them to join the protests. They defaced government websites with anti-regime messages and leaked docs showing secret dealings with countries like Russia. Their stated goal was to expose corruption and free political prisoners. Oh, I'm going to brutalize this one. The next one was Gaharni Segumi, aka Gaham Te Seguni, which means uprising to overthrow in Persian. They emerged in early 2023 and they hit Iran's foreign ministry in May of that year. They leaked tons of data and replacing the homepage with images of opposition leaders and those of crossed out photos of Supreme Leader Khamenei. Later, they went on to take over 500 Ministry of Science servers and dumping files on protest crackdowns and university purges to all the dissidents. And then the last group worth mentioning is DOOKHTEGAN. They appeared in September of 2022, early in the protest as well, and they targeted religious groups within Iran. Their attacks crashed servers and software right before a massive religious event, and the whole goal was to cause massive disruption. DOOKHTEGAN means goblin or nightmare in Farsi. The point is that these groups have risen organically or as part of a foreign intelligence operation to assist in the goal of regime change. Since the stated goal of regime change is both pushed internally and from the domestic populace and from countries like Israel, it's a bit of a toss-up for who's actually behind funding these groups, though. So let's explore the other angle of that now. Now is the time in the show where I expose the audience to conspiracy theories. And then, like an idiot, I speculate on top of that. Once again, I don't have any inside knowledge or anything that you can't look up publicly that's available from sources or by searching on Grok or Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever else you like to use. So take this next section with a huge grain of salt and maybe a healthy, very healthy dose of skepticism. I'm not trying to tell anyone how to think here. I just want to give as much of the information I can in a balanced view. And with that, let's roll the song.
Believe it or not, it's conspiracy time. Tinfoil hats stuck on our heads, following trails that intertwine. Where do they lead? Believe it or not, we'll see.
On the internet, some people have speculated that Lab2Tagan is a frontman for a nation-state group that has been dumping information in the public, but doesn't do so through official channels in order to maintain a level of plausible deniability. In this case, the United States or Israeli government, or closely aligned actors with them. Once again, this is a speculation circulating in cybersecurity discussions here. Now, it positions arguments that the group's sophisticated operations, strategic targeting, and public alignment serve Western geopolitical interests, all to provide plausible deniability for state-sponsored cyber actions amid escalating U.S., Israel, Iran tensions. And I want to stress that while there's no concrete proof that exists of direct manning by U.S. agencies, for example, the CIA or NSA, as well as Israeli intel, Mossad personnel, this is all circumstantial evidence. Now, I'm going to do my best to outline supporting evidence, timeline implications, and a balanced breakdown. Let's start first with some broad observations from spending a ton of time in their Telegram channel and abusing the translate button in my web browser. The first of which is the operational sophistication and resource access of Lab2Tagan's attacks. Looking at the one I opened with, the March 2025 disruption of 116 Iranian vessels via supply chain compromise of the VSAT systems, these demonstrate a few tactics. First, they're able to get root level access blocks and automate malware deployment through some sort of orchestration. And they're allowed to persist and surveil over a long period of time without detection. I mean, this level of coordination, wiping partitions and intercepting voice over IP across fleets, it kind of exceeds hacktivist capabilities in most cases. This could suggest external backing from entities like the US or Israeli intelligence. Or, I mean, this could be any nation state backing them. The Russians have demonstrated abilities to mess with navigation systems too, but you're kind of missing the motive portion of that equation there. Now, I went to the United States and Israel based on explicit public support for the US and Israeli operations that they support in their communications. In October of 2023, amid the Israel-Hamas war, LabDoOKHTEGAN's Telegram channel pledged, quote, America has openly expressed its support for Israel and is sending its forces to the region to strengthen support Israel. Following this, we and the DOOKHTEGAN group express our readiness for all-around cooperation with America and Israel. Do not give Hezbollah and Hamas terrorists a chance. We, the people of Iran, strongly condemn the support of the terrorist regime of the Islamic Republic and stand by the enemies of this terrorist regime. End quote. Now, the last line of this decree is what gets my attention. Quote, we, the people of Iran, strongly condemn the support of the terrorist regime of the Islamic Republic and stand by the enemies of the terrorist regime. End quote. It's long been believed that if there was going to be a regime change in Iran, it was going to be at the hands of the public. A public uprising of sorts that I guess leads to a new leader or a new party in charge. I don't know exactly what the thinking is there, and I haven't really heard a clear explanation of kind of what happens next. Like, what if it's a bunch of jihadist head choppers like in Syria? Is that really a better situation than the current regime? I don't know. These are all questions for people whose opinions matter in this. Where I was getting to is that there's been all kinds of psyops type messaging trying to encourage the population to rise up against the regime. During attacks on the nuclear facilities, there were telephone calls telling a general to film messages that the regime is collapsing, and even overt calls to solve crises in exchange for the population if they overthrow the government. The one that comes to mind is when Iran ordered a day off of businesses and office closures to alleviate pressure on the electrical grid, and they announced that Iran needed to ration water as they could have dry dams by this time in 2025, in November 2025 as well. There's a bunch of variables here. Climate change or extremely hot summers having some impact, sanctions on Iran making it difficult for them to maintain their grid, their aging nuclear power generation capabilities, and that they have to go offline for 2 months or so every year for maintenance. There's a lot in play here. Plus, authoritarians have a really hard time running infrastructure in general, it seems. However, in response, Benjamin Netanyahu compared Iran's thirst for water for their thirst for freedom. Then went on to say Israel would be happy to help Iran when the regime was toppled, help them with their water issue. Obviously, this went over well with the Iranians, and the president of Iran went on to mock Netanyahu, and I think we all kind of get the picture of what that looked like. Now back to LabDoOKHTEGAN. This aligns with U.S. deployments in the region and Israeli operations, positioning the group as an ideological ally on their side during this conflict. I guess that was the overarching point I wanted to highlight, and I felt it needed some context there. In some analysis of their operations seem to note their focus on U.S. sanctioned targets, like the NITC and the IRISL. These are the shadow fleets evading oil ban sanctions. And the timing with U.S. operations on the Houthis should be considered. As in, this could imply that there were coordinated attacks on these vessels as a way to curb sanctions evading without really going kinetic on them. Using a proxy group like LabDoOKHTEGAN could be a way to do so with plausible deniability, or as a way to demonstrate a type of grassroots support for regime change. Now, I'm not saying if the US or Israel is involved that that's necessarily a bad thing, and to be honest with you, from an outsider perspective and from my perspective, I guess, it's pretty awesome that they could maintain that OPSEC for so long. I mean, that really emphasizes their level of detail and technical capability. Now, to wrap this section up, let's discuss some hacktivist groups that have been proven to be government-backed, or at least strongly suggested to be. We can also highlight it that way, I guess. The idea here is that I want to give a point of reference of what other groups look like. Killnet is the one that comes to mind first. Emerging in March of 2022, a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, and that could be a clue, this pro-Russian hacker collective is known for their denial of service, or DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks towards government institutions and private companies across several countries. This is attacks on government websites in Romania, Czech Republic government websites. They even went after Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor here in the United States, in retaliation for the US giving HIMARS systems to the Ukrainian government. There's plenty of other attacks out there too on Germany and Japan and more countries that I'm excluding. I think we all get the point here. The government-backed ties to Killnet, though, were originally placed on the GRU unit APT-28, which tends to be more focused on espionage, but it was later changed to APT-44, the more destructive and, in my opinion, notorious of the GRU-backed groups, Sandworm. Andy Greenberg wrote an amazing book on the group, and Google wrote a report that kind of picks up where Andy Greenberg's book lets off. I'll link through to both of them. But this attribution is coming from the report titled, Hacktivists Collaborate with GRU-Sponsored APT-28. And I know that sounds confusing. They had a correction that I will read first. Quote, Update April 2024. The Telegram front personas detailed in this blog post were previously attributed to APT-28 based on a case of cohabitation, where APT-28 and APT-44 were both operating in the same network. Reanalysis of the relevant incident data allows us to parse the two sets of overlapping activity and link the intrusion activity claimed by these Telegram channels to APT-44, aka Sandworm, with high confidence. This blog post has been amended to reflect this updated attribution. End quote. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon to have multiple groups from the same quote-unquote team in the same network. Everyone's trying to get that better desk in Moscow. And then the core attribution lies here in the executive summary. Quote, we assess with moderate confidence that moderators of the purported hacktivist Telegram channel, Zaxnet team, Info Center, and Cyber Army of Russia Reborn are coordinating their operations with U.S. Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, sponsored cyber threat actors. Our assessment is based in part on the deployment of GRU-sponsored APT-44 tools on the networks of Ukrainian victims, whose data was leaked on Telegram within 24 hours of wiping activity by APT-44, as well as other indicators of inauthentic activity by the moderators and similarities to previous GRU information operations. End quote. Now, those are all channels in which Killnet hangs out, just if that wasn't clear. I don't think one has to stretch their imagination too far to see how it's highly suspect that victims of an org have all their data stolen and leaked right before APT-44 tide wipers burn the place down. Maybe it looks bad if APT-44 is leaking the information too. Maybe they're just trying to maintain like a level of confusion. It's possible they don't really care. This could be like off the books hacking too. Who knows? But I think that's the point though. Not really understanding the motives of the group, or more importantly, where or what they do next. Now, pivoting to the other side of the battlefield, we can examine Blackjack. Now, this group, Blackjack, is a pro-Ukrainian hacktivist group that emerged in late 2023 amid the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, this group positions itself as a cyber vigilante force, or I guess more fitting a collective. Their goal is targeting Russian state and military infrastructure, often through data breaches, destructive malware, and denial of service attacks. Now, while it operates within a hacktivist facade, the mask is kind of fallen off already. There are public claims via anonymous channels and ideological rhetoric against Russian aggression that some analysts have classified Blackjack as a state-aligned actor, mainly due to its sophisticated capabilities and alignment with Ukrainian national interests. Now, Blackjack has been responsible for high-profile disruptions, focusing on retaliation for Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian targets and telecom provider Kyivstar. Some of those disruptions include, in December of 2023, they attacked the Rostov Canal water utility Now, the stated reason was in retaliation for the Russian hack on Ukraine's Kyivstar Telecom, which disrupted the service for millions. Now, Blackjack breached the Moscow-based water utility and deleted over 50 terabytes of data, including backups and internal documents, and compromised 6,000 plus computers, temporarily disrupting water management services. Ukrainian Security Services, the state-backed SBU, has publicly stated that they reviewed 1.5 terabytes of the exfiltrated data for intelligence value. Now, keeping up the momentum, in January of 2024, the M9 Telecom ISP disruption took place. Apparently, they were pretty mad about Kyivstar. Now, this attack was stated as being once again further revenge for Kyivstar being brought down. Blackjack destroyed 20 terabytes of data, causing internet and TV outages for residents of Russia. They exfiltrated 10 gigabytes of client databases and mail servers. An SBU source further went on to confirm their involvement in the attack as well. In January of 2024, again, they struck a Russian military construction firm. Or specifically, they attacked like the Russian state enterprise that was handling the Ministry of Defense construction. They walked out the door with 1.2 terabytes of classified plans for 500 military sites. These are things like garrisons, forward operating bases, arsenals, air defense systems. Now, the data was deleted from 7 servers and shared with the Ukrainian GRU for potential targeting. Now, this was praised by Ukrainian intel as a major blow to Russian hostilities. And then the last one I'll talk about was in April of 2024. This was the Owen Cloud data center destruction attack. This is the most obvious in my opinion. In a joint SBU operation, Blackjack deployed Voxnet malware against owencloud.ru, a data center serving the Russian military, their energy sector, and specifically Gazprom, along with some telecommunication firms as well. Now, they destroyed 300 terabytes of data across 10,000 hosts, and they were wiping sensors and disrupting Moscow's utilities. Now, this was in retaliation for the January attack on the Perovsky data center. Now, you may be asking, why would Ukraine utilize proxies of hacktivist groups as like a layer of obfuscation on their operations against Russia? Well, I think it comes down into like a psyop sort of way, a way to show grassroots civilian resistance to other Ukrainians, and more importantly, organic support for prosecuting this war further against Russia, specifically to the United States and the EU, as they are the ones financing Ukraine as they fight back. Something along the lines of, quote, our citizens still have a lot of fight in them, see how they're being vigilantes and they're hacking back. Like I said, something like that. And just to be clear, I'm not saying the Ukrainians are giving up or that they should give up. The courage of the army to stay in the fight and ingenuity of the citizens has been something that has changed the face of warfare. Everyone with the big military is paying attention to their drone tactics. But having a state-sponsored or state-backed hacktivist group is a way to magnify this to the world, in a world in which the internet and social media exist. It's like the old tactic of starting 3 fires per man instead of 1 to show that the army is bigger than it actually is. This isn't a way to avoid deniability, it's kind of the opposite, amplifying force projection that may not be there actually. In cyber warfare, there's the asymmetric nature of it, that it kind of allows for this to happen a little bit more than in meat space, which is a contrast to the killnet operations as Russia tries to appear more quote-unquote law-abiding. So doing quote-unquote illegal things or war crimes could open them up to more hostilities from nations helping Ukraine, more than they already are. I mean, if you believe at this point that the lines of demarcation aren't already established, I would beg to differ. I think people who matter have already established a side in this conflict. And I don't really think that their opinions of Killnet are going to change any of that. And then there are arguments that Russia seems to lob, like we don't respect Zelensky because he isn't the lawful president. He doesn't really have elections or something along those lines. And I only say this because the Russians do like to lob kind of legal accusations there, specifically around like, we don't respect Zelensky because he's not the lawful president because there hasn't been elections. All of this could make diplomacy a little more messy is what I'm trying to get to. And well, now that I have sufficiently discussed both hot button conflicts going on in 2025, I think this is a good place to start wrapping this episode up. I hope you walked away from this episode with an understanding that hacktivist groups can emphasize the asymmetric effects of cyber warfare, and while it's tempting for nation states to hide behind them, they add a layer of confusion to an already murky, confusing, obscure battlefield. Lab2Tagan being the case study for this episode. But there's others that you could have drawn upon. Ones that have all but been confirmed to be state-sponsored, like Killnet, or those clearly that weren't but got caught, like LulzSec, a group that compromised the PlayStation Network, brought down the CIA website, and was going all out to showcase the weaknesses of modern cybersecurity infrastructure. Now, one of the founders got rolled up by law enforcement and then turned into an informant to kind of bring down the others. I'm going to do a future episode on their escapades, but the point is that they aren't believed to be government-backed, although I'm sure you can probably find some internet fringe that says otherwise. There's also lone wolf hacktivists that you could consider. Guccifer 2.0 and even Phineas Fisher. Now, Guccifer 2.0 is covered in my first episode of Not Pet Yet. This was a Romanian hacker that could barely speak Romanian and is probably some Russian intel officer named Yuri in all actuality. I have an entire series on Phineas Fisher as well, a cult hero of sorts that became famous or notorious for never being caught after their attacks on spyware companies. Oh, and for publishing manifestos documenting how they did it and calls to arms for offensive cyber ops. Now back to the meta discussion of these groups though, ultimately they boil down to two breakouts. Proxies, these are individual groups paid for by the state or funded by the state, and like covert action. I don't really have a fleshed out term for them, but it's like government employees, usually military or intelligence community people, acting as an organic group built to establish a new persona. Now, separating these is incredibly difficult, and it's not uncommon to see those like Mandiant come back and correct an article after it's been published because new evidence comes to light, just like we discussed with Killnet. Now, this stuff is hard and it's confusing, and that's why they do it. And none of this is new. It's just the medium in which we do it has changed. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Russians utilized proxies for covert actions against one another to avoid a full-on nuclear war, but help cripple one another in a way. And to be honest, I think all of that escalates. There's a bunch of factors at play, and since you're not allowed to have anything tech-related in 2025 without saying the words Gen AI, so to meet that requirement and check the box, it's also worth highlighting that this technology can help translation and projection of these tedious tasks to maintain proxy operational security very easily. All right, so there's that. Check. Another variable that is kind of emerging is the contracting out of historically financially backed groups to state-backed groups, or like they're working together. Now, technically, the sponsors recruit proxies through financial incentives, bounties, ransomware shares, etc. You give me your access and you can ransomware this group when I'm on my way out. Or it could be ideologically aligned, anti-regime dissidents or fighting back against an invading army. Or even coercion. This could be like Comparad or criminals or something. We won't arrest you if you help Mother Russia bring down these capitalist scum. These operations often follow a command and control light model. Essentially, loose guidance via like encrypted channels or non-traditional comms with proxies adapting tools like custom malware or commercial exploit kits. Now, this presents attribution challenges due to shared TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it's hard to get a clear picture if everyone's using publicly available exploits on edge devices and then using post-exploitation via hacked Cobalt Strike or something. It takes a layer of further analysis to see which modules or techniques within Cobalt Strike are being used, or tracking back to where the exploit came from, then doing some sort of infrastructure analysis on the certs or something using something like Census. The point is that it's hard, it's time confusing, and there's not a huge swath of people with this knowledge or skill set either. Competency in this domain is lacking in cybersecurity. There's a small subset of jobs for individuals, as orgs typically care about like how well you can patch things based off CVS scores or compliance dashboards. That's an entirely different podcast, as that does have its place as well. But while effective, these proxies, they aren't foolproof. Over-reliance can lead to blowback. Proxies turning rogue or leaking sponsor intel, for example, if they aren't paid. Ethically, they blur a civilian-military line, raising concerns in international law. Now, this line is generally kind of ignored in modern warfare, even from sophisticated modern armies. Modern in air quotes there. But for defenders, the strategy of countering this surprisingly isn't technical as much as it's psychological and straight up old-fashioned, imposing cost. It involves disrupting proxy funding, sanctions on facilitators, and building distrust among the paranoid actors, leaking information that certain forum members are feds, or other tactics to make members question each other's loyalty. It's kind of a sort of irregular warfare waged by both the defenders and the attackers. When the comms are heavily encrypted and sparse, it's really hard to ask for confirmation, especially when both parties are trying to remain anonymous. So you can kind of capitalize on that. As always, the question is always scale, though. How do you impose costs at scale on networks not designed to scale in general? That is the question. And that's a good place to stop. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do all the social media things. Like, share, subscribe, review, rate on your favorite podcast player of choice. It's 2025. I think you all know what to do by now. Oh, and only 5-star reviews. If you hate this podcast and you've made it this far, please just log that in like your daily journal or something else that's not public. Thanks for spending the time with me. It really means a lot that you picked my podcast in the flood of everything that's grasping for your attention here in the modern world. I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.
Crank